I'm sharing my screen with you, and I will start now my presentation. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for having me to this conference. I will now start with my slide, if it works. The next one, yeah. So I'm obviously coming from New Zealand. New Zealand is quite some nice distance away from a lot of other things, and you see here where New Zealand is located. You see a little glimpse of the island. The flight time is between 11 to 19 hours. So you can imagine it is quite remote to every other location. And this is the city, Wellington, where I am. The wonderful thing in New Zealand is at the moment we are totally COVID-free. And following to the conversation which we just heard from the other keynote, is we having a very interesting life, because being an island, very remote, went through very severe lockdown. Now we can continue our life as it was without pandemic. We cannot travel, nobody can come in, nobody can come out, but we can have a normal life within New Zealand. And that gives us a very different perspective of what the pandemic is and what urban life is. At the same time, we are so remote from everything else, and the only way that we can communicate with the rest of the world and be part of it is using digital media. Now, looking at what just was said, the development of urbanization and urban cities, for example, in China, for example, in Africa, is vast. It is immense of what is being built there and what needs to be planned. And you see here that photo, it is not just made in a different color. It is really an environmental problem, not only building, housing, and offering living conditions for people, but how can we at the same time engage that we cure our planet rather than use our planet. Now here in this overview, we see the density of different cities around the world, and that photo was taken 2011. Obviously it has changed again. But what is striking to see, for example, Hong Kong, with a huge density, everybody very dense together on a very small footprint, while in the same area than Hong Kong, for example, London has more or less the same population, but everything is spread out and we don't have any green spaces in between. And then we have, for example, Istanbul or Mumbai, where this whole thing even explodes more, that the whole land is used as well as the density. And that requires that we think differently. What is the urban? How do we actually organize our city? How can we provide the housing for it? And how can we negotiate the nature around it? We're using all computer, we're using digital media, we use software, we use things in this context. And what I think is really crucial is that we use the technology not as a tool which executes things, but that we use technology as a way of about how we think about design, and then use technology as a partner in the design and exchange our ideas rather than just execute it in one way. And we all, as architects, know that the client and the contractors and everybody requires that we change. We have to change to the very end. Now with a digital tool, we can change all the time, but this is really the problem. How can we deal with a change which is all the time happening? It's never there. How can we actually design something and be in this fluxus stage, but still presents a meaningful outcome which stays for a certain time and can be used in this context? This is the realm in which we work. On one hand, on the right side, the virtual environment, pure virtual. This, you could say this is your design idea. It happens in your mind. On the other side, on the left side, this is reality. This is where then the thing is actually built and it comes in. But in the way of how we work, and more we work in this virtual space, in the augmented, in the mixed reality, and we're moving actually more to the right side, where the actual output is just happen to be an entity in that realm in which we work and which we are and which we live. Now, with the rise of the computer, was in 1955, there was that it was this drawing saying this is the future of the architect, how the architect will work. And you see there in the vision, there has a computer keyboard, kind of a big mouse, has 3 viewpoints: plan, section, elevation, the telephone, the internet to the combination, and basically generates and use the computer to do the plans. Now, on the right side, with, for example, AutoCAD or any CAD software, we're working still in the same realm, in the same environment where we have not changed in the past 70 years. However, I think now there is a chance with the advent of augmented and virtual reality to work very differently. And as soon as you have a headset on, we have to work differently, because the engagement with the computer suddenly becomes something very different. Using technology not in the way at how it was perceived originally is nothing new. For example, photography was used not only to take a picture of a scene, but actually to use it in a different way to generate this artwork. And you see here in the second picture where Jörn Utzon is drawing with a torch in the air and using a long exposure, you suddenly get the drawing and the sketch out of it. And it's interesting, there's a virtual drawing with a light, but the technology allows us then to understand what the drawing was about. So as architects, as designers, we actually don't necessarily have the problem. We generate the problem by defining how we deal with the issue which we are confronted with. And that is a very interesting process, because we state problems which then will be addressed, and we reframe them, will be addressed. So we are actually in this whole spectrum a very crucial part, and we play an important part in that, because we frame what the problem is in the first place, and then develop whether it can be solved, and we work with engineers and we work with other people to see whether we can address these problems. Now we engage more with the computer, and we all kind of have to learn from a pencil drawing over AutoCAD or some CAD software, and we all start now to program and to do something in a computational programming. However, this grasshopper, which I now say is now the script which everybody uses, becomes a tool which automatically says what the architecture is. So we're doing the design, what the tool can do, rather than think about how we can use the environment. And these scripts and this computation generates then plans, which in this viewpoint is not legible to anybody anymore. So we now have to translate that, bring it into a virtual environment, three-dimensional, to understand what is the technology, the building technology within a building, to understand how are the ducting, what are the pipes, how are the cables, how can I actually do and build everything and get things together. And I can go then into a plan, into a detail level, which is in reality not possible, and which is on a typical representation, plan, section, elevation, also not possible to really understand the complexity of what we design. And this is where I think, where we work with technology in a very different way, which we earlier did not work, because we work three-dimensionally and we can zoom in into a level of detail which was earlier not that possible, or it was just too time-consuming to produce. So by that, we're producing different architecture, different elements. And for example, here, the construction of the Daegeum Museum in Seoul, having this panel cladding, and these panels, very nice as an idea, but generates 50,000 different panels, which are unique and each have to be fabricated and then put on site. Now, this is too much work for one person to do. So as a designer, as an architect, we not only design how it looks and we want these panels, but we now have to design the machine which can produce these panels. And that is the machine which produces these panels. So we have an idea, we develop the code, we are the code writer, we are the person then develop the machine, and we develop a system of everything is put together. That changed very much the idea of what an architect is. At the same time, we have the human being, and that is actually the beauty. So we develop this complex system, and we know of how we do our ducting, our pipes, how we build, how we put things together. But as a small error, a new pipe, and how do you now deal with it? Well, we just go through the window. We smash the window and go through it. This is really interesting. So we plan, and you see here at Hong Kong Airport, done by Foster's, who planned in detail of how the ducting can go through the beams and has the formwork built like that you can put the pipes through the beams. However, at the very last one on the right side, these holes were forgotten, were not placed into the formwork. So this whole idea of how to place the pipe in is void. And the person on the construction side says, well, I'm just putting it now underneath. And we are on the construction side. Again, we've designed something in the computer, in a digital environment. We designed something in an office far away from the actual place where people put together in a very different level, in a very different skill level. And we get these tolerances here for that, in that sample, for example. And we have to think about how can we design in the system that at the end it can work very well. So I'm presenting now a couple of the projects which we do here at our university, and that is the eye tracking of an urban environment using now VR and the tracking of how the person goes through the VR. So we built something, and we have a lot of assumption of how people use a city, how they orientate themselves, what they look at. With our tool, it allows us to see exactly where people look, where they focus, and what they explore in this context. Then we can replay that, and you see here the dots popping up, and we can suddenly understand of how the person actually goes through the city and what is important in that going through the city. That allows us to design differently. We can actually now have an evaluation of our design, whether that happens what we think it should happen, rather than we have built a lot of an assumption. And that has importance in health and safety. How do we plan for roads and streets? How we plan escape routes in buildings? How do we deal with our environment in this context? Here again, we can generate a heat map on this intersection. When people stand there, where do I look at? And we can now compare what's happening in a virtual environment versus then the real one, and suddenly understand very differently of how the city is actually used by the citizens. So what I argue for is not about the Internet of Spaces, which is a very common term now, that we have gadgets and sensors which come together and it's the Internet of Things. I think more it is the Internet of Spaces, basically saying it is all the sketches, all the technology come together, talk to us, and we are part of it. It is a spatial exchange rather than an exchange of things in goods and sensors within. So looking at the next project, City VR, we all have our mobile phones. We have the devices which are sitting in the city, how you can orientate yourself from one to the other. So what we developed, instead of that, you look all the time at your screen, which gives you the map of how you walk and the navigation, and you go from one point to the other. We said, how can we use now certain markers as actually the actual marker? You download it basically on your device and you see it really from a top view, not in an elevation, because people see the differently, where they're not architects, they need a different understanding of where it is. They can mark the point where they want to go. And then instead of being all the time told, go right, go left, you hold once in a while your mobile phone up and you get this very large marker in the city, and you say, okay, this is the direction where I have to go, and you search your way by yourself, finding this direction. So it is a very different way of how we use a navigation tool, which does not tell us go right, go left, go straight. It just say, this is the general direction. This is where you where you want to end up, but explore the way to go there and be part of the city and look at the city rather than only at your screen telling you all the time right and left. So we presented that work at some other work at Ars Electronica in Austria, which was the same thing through the pandemic. It could not happen at the location, but it became an online event. And we had the plan of the actual exhibition, that's what we planned. So we then had a digital twin and saying instead of having the actual exhibition where all the digital artwork is presented, we moved that into a digital realm in a pure VR environment where people then could from any place explore the artwork and what is done. So one artwork here, Architecture of the Sea, which we developed, is looking at what is actually happening under the sea, in the sea. We are all surrounded by oceans. Japan, New Zealand have the same conditions. We are living very much from the oceans. However, we have only a limited understanding what is happening under the sea. How can we now interpret that spatially and can have an understanding of what is happening there? And is that something where we can learn at and can get a certain awareness of how the oceans and the water can help us on the land to understand where we go? Another project for that, for Ars Electronica, was the visual sensory convergence, basically saying, if you now in VR, which is normally only something very visual, can we add more senses to it? Can we add sound, feeling, tactic, smell to it to make it a more rich experience? At the same time, we did not want to copy reality. We wanted to have an experience, an architectural and a design expression which is unique for a VR environment. So we have here the one person in VR and the other person being an actor acting for the person in VR, not knowing there's an actor, just realizing there's objects flying around which you can interact on, and you can touch it and you have a certain feedback that generate certain things. But you generate an experience, a world, a reality which makes sense within a pure virtual environment, and you design for something which is matching for a different realm. Coming back more to participatory and real environment, using AR and parametric design allows us to put with certain markers, with certain elements, we can now build architecture and places put together where people who build something understand more as a lay person, can engage now with an architecture, understand that much more, because a simple plan would be too complicated for them to understand. But with these elements, and this is just as a prototype at the moment, we can now build different combinations, and people can understand of how their environment, their house, their section, their city can be built. What is actually the impact if I want to have a shed, if I want to have green, how does it work in this context? And you can have now a whole library element, and you can explore that obviously deeper to other objects. Thinking of that engagement, we also developed a tool which is very simple for anybody to generate their own environment within VR. So you see here now somebody is in VR, and you see that point of view, and you have a very simple tool where you can just generate objects, and you build the environment which you want to have around you in a one-to-one or more or less one-to-one scale. So this allows you to, without that you be an architect, a designer, to generate an expression of your space around you, which then can be interpreted by an architect or by a designer to that what you actually want. So it enables now a very different engagement on a different discussion between the designer, the architect, and the client, the architect and the engineer, to allow what is actually what you want to build. And here you see that more now in a real context, an urban context, where the city council wanted to build something, and they showed certain proposals, but people were not happy and didn't really understand. So we gave them that tool, and now the citizens were able to design their own environment to a certain extent, and gave that back to the city and said, look, this is what we actually think about our environment. We're living here. This is something, can we now explore something in that way? So we allowed people to do things which they were earlier not possible, without that they need big training in terms of architecture and design. It gives them just a voice that they can express what they want to do. And now pushing that even a bit further is if we now question how we design in the first place. So instead of using the hand or the mouse and so on, can we use actually our eyes, our visual, not only as a one way to see, but can we use the eyes to draw? And what you see here is, by looking at places, I now can draw with my eyes, because the eyes are tracked in this environment to generate the form or to subtract the form. So it really questions the engagement of how I design and how I communicate with the digital instruments around me. So I not use my hands, I only use my eyes. And that matches if I wear a headset in VR where I don't see my hands. I can actually, just by looking at things, I can generate the design, the form, and and know what I want to do. Now, sure, this is a very crude moment, and it's a very prototype, and it doesn't give you the sophistication and the detail what a hand sketch can do, but it can give you very quick the possibility to interact with the computer only using your eyes, and then work from there. Now, if we look at more abstract terms, can we design sacredness or a religious context in a virtual environment, in a space which is not real? So, for example, if your Islamic faith, where it's very crucial that you orientate yourself towards Mecca, in a virtual environment, there is no Mecca. So how can you now practice that very crucial element in an environment where a certain things is not existing? So is there an interpretation? How can we interpret that in a different way? And that was this exploration here. And this is another one, for example, also washing is an important part. How can you, the experience of cleansing in all religion that is an issue, how can you deal with this idea of cleansing in water in a pure virtual environment? And by learning from that, by learning the new interpretation, we can look back into reality and see how do we deal with these elements and how can we treat these resources differently. And that comes to the more or less the last project which I want to talk today to you about, is if we now go pure in a virtual environment where we don't want to copy reality, what does then a spatial expression mean within a pure VR environment where there is no wall, there is no physical laws? How can you define something which doesn't follow normal rules, and how can you that as an architect, as a designer, respond to that? Now, reality is for most of us at the moment pretty dire. We are in a lockdown, we cannot go, we can't meet, we've been socially isolated, we are physically isolated, and reality is this: we look at our environment, and if we look at most of the environments in suburbia where we are, it is really not something which is really desirable, which makes us actually feel good. What makes us feel good is really coming together, and that was some time ago where people could meet still, but here people, 10,000 people together in a place, designing, doing something together in the same virtual environment, at the same time being in the same physical environment. There is a very interesting social interaction between the people in the place physically, as well as the interaction online. And there's something which we can learn about how can we make a social environment, a social interaction possible when we are physically now have to distance ourselves. If we have to wear a mask, if we have to not come close together, how can we keep the social aspect together, and how can we do that in an architectural space? Now, just as future vision, when we now with augmented reality and interesting glassing can superimpose everything on reality, we have to question to a certain aspect, do we still need shop fronts because everything can be superimposed on top of it? Do we need still street lights because we can just simulate that within our environment? How is a city, can we design that, and how can we do that if all information to it is given to us to augmented classes rather than through the physical aspect? So it becomes suddenly something very different of how we think about what we now use as a typical thing. For example, riding a bus. What is the bus? What is the street? What is actually the environment outside, where suddenly things are very differently? Now, this is a very much maybe a bit too much in this context, but we have to think a bit more how we design spaces where now technology becomes more and more omnipresent and people use it. How do we now react to that the city in which we work still works and is attractive and is good for all of us? Corbusier went to Rome, generate this sketch, and said, well, Rome is basically a city made out of spheres and cylinders. It's interesting that he said spheres and cylinders, which are three-dimensional objects, not 2D, and not saying square and circles. But what he says, you can reduce a city to a couple of shapes, but what it makes the city interesting is the combination of it, and it makes it interesting because of the social engagement and how we interact it and make that actually an interesting place. I work obviously with a big team, not only me, and I'm really grateful for my colleagues, my students, my partners, that I can work and can generate this kind of outcome. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for this talk.